Welcome to DE&I by another name, Moving Beyond Diversity. Over the past year, there has been a growing backlash against DEI initiatives, and it's been fueled by a number of things: cultural shifts and dynamics, our national uh, dialogue, political polarization, economic shifts and pressures. And despite this pushback, this work has been going on for quite some time. And as we'll see in a moment, I'm looking at it from a 40-year window, but it goes even back farther than that. And so in this session today, what I'm hoping we can do is reframe some of this dialogue and get a better sense of what it is that we're actually trying to do here. So my name is Jana Etienne. I'm a certified diversity executive and I'm a CPA. I spent 26 years in public accounting. 17 of those years I had my own firm. And then I shifted my career. I'm still a CPA, but instead of working in the profession, I'm working for the profession. And my work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion, which I define as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. I develop trainings and workshops, as well as facilitate conversations and programs focused on helping participants understand inclusion as something we do and demonstrate. It starts with connecting mindfulness and self-awareness to our daily actions and words. The result? A collective greater awareness and intentionality within organizations to cultivate inclusivity, to create a space where each of us can simply be who we are as we are. Today, I want to look at three things. And I'm framing this not exactly as three parts, but I wanted to make it clear as we go through. So the first part is what I'm calling looking back. And so how has this work evolved over the last 40 years or so? Second part is thinking about diversity holistically, where all of us are included in the conversation. And then looking forward, what do each of us need to belong? So we're going to start by looking at the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are other terms that are used in this work, like accessibility, accommodation, belonging is a newer term. I chose to stick with DEI in the title because those other words that I talked about just now, those are concepts that are included, in that overarching body of work. So first, I wanted to start by differentiating the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of the history and evolution of the work. We'll look at definitions, so to speak, a little later. But for now, I thought it would be helpful to see these elements as part of that framework of the body of work. So we'll start with diversity. Now, I said over the past 40 years, the landscape of workplace diversity and inclusion, DE&I, if you will, has undergone significant transformation. It's evolved from a concept to today a critical component of modern day organizational culture, business strategy, and financial performance. So the first step was getting women and minorities and people from underrepresented groups in the door, diversity, hence, and getting in the door, removing barriers to entry, which is what I have here. Today, our workforce is more diverse than it has ever been at any time in the past. But that workforce diversity, it hasn't always been the case. Next is equity, which I'm framing as removing barriers to advancement. Now, it's one thing to get people in the door. It's another thing to keep people there. And so part of that, what's important is the concept of equity. And a lot of people think equity is equality, but really what is equity? It's about fairness. It's about ensuring that we all have the resources and the tools and the information we need that levels the playing field so all of us can be successful. Now, those terms I used earlier, accessibility and accommodation, and I mentioned they're part of the work, they live here in equity. Equity is access, accessibility, but access. And by that, I mean not just accessibility in terms of mobility, but I think about it in terms of access to information, access to opportunities, access to leadership for mentorship and champions, access to opportunities for promotion, and so much more. And then accommodation, those are really about for people who have different abilities, in some case, disabilities, the way they're defined. I'll actually share that definition in a moment. We might need special tools or different tools and resources to do our jobs. So equity is all of that. It's removing those barriers so that we can be successful in an organization. Then there's inclusion. And I call this one removing social barriers because getting in the door doesn't mean you're going to be part of the group, so to speak. It can be lonely when you're the only or one of a few. It can be especially hard when you're the first. I mean, imagine for a moment what it must have felt like to be that first woman in the boardroom ever. I'm talking about the woman who broke the glass ceiling. You know that saying, it can be lonely at the top? Well, it can also be lonely being the only. We are social creatures, and the workplace is yet an ecosystem, just like other communities that we live in. And it relies on us as humans connecting, talking, trusting, sharing. We need to be doing all of that for an organization to thrive. We're also naturally tribal. And so our brains are wired to notice difference. Back in the day, noticing difference, that was potentially danger. And so it makes sense. But here's the thing, our brains are slow to evolve. They're amazing. Our brains guide our bodies throughout the day, our thinking, our gestures, our movements, our expressions, all of that stuff every day. It's what I call flying on autopilot. Okay, I know this isn't a program on unconscious bias, but it's important to pause for a moment because it's directly linked to this topic of inclusion and what that process means. So from birth, we're taking in information, we're processing that information. Either we're seeing it, we're hearing it, we're experiencing it, we've been told about it, it's in the media. And as we, over time, learn that, we process it, categorize it, create rules, and so to speak. And then eventually this process gets shortcut. We start to create filters, and our brain then makes these automatic decisions that drive our actions, but we're not necessarily aware of that. And so by understanding these ingrained patterns that are now in our subconscious mind, it gives us an opportunity to interrupt that automatic processing, interrupt that autopilot, if you will. And this is important because this is what helps us break down this tribalness and breaks down this natural tendency to cluster in groups of the same. Creating an inclusive culture is a big part of what we're trying to do so that when you are the only, when you're the newbie, when you're one of a few, when you're somebody who's different, likely visibly different, it can be harder to fit in. And so the effort around inclusion is about being intentional, I was talking about earlier. So when I said DE&I work, we've been doing this for over 100 years. This isn't new work. We just keep calling it different things. So initially, let's go back. The workplace was male dominated. And in our country, we live in a society that is generally binary in terms of gender. So there are men and women, nothing in between. That's a construct, but that's a different session. So there are men and women, and for the roles, men, man, woman, male, female, there are gendered expectations. And one of those is that women holding traditional roles, they weren't in the workplace. Their role was in the home. And that changed. A lot of it changed in World War II. Do you remember Rosie the Riveter, a massive PR campaign by the federal government to bring women into the workforce? Did you know that over 350,000 women served in the military during World War II? So this huge and very fast shift in the gender demographics in the country was sparked by, a lot of it was sparked by this movement that followed World War II or as a result of World War II. And yet, in the workplace, women still struggled for things like working with less pay, having to navigate childcare, and maintaining and still having those expectations for the gendered roles of taking care of the household. Now, this massive shift was a turning point, and it led to a lot of economic change and social change. It sparked some of these early laws related to policies that ensure workplace standards and rules that create fairness for everyone. And as you can see here, there's been a steady progression of executive orders and actions and laws that address access, remember diversity, creating barriers to entry, and fairness, remember equity, eliminating barriers to advancement. And these laws also addressed an increasingly wider range of groups. So race, ethnicity, disability, gender, sexual identity, and more. Women, minorities, people with disabilities, and other groups have faced difficulties with a lot of isms over the years. So isms, sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia, lack of accommodations for people with physical or mental conditions, sexual harassment, lower wages. The list goes on. I mean, that actually sounds really bad when I say it that way. It's a long list, let me say that. And the different laws that you see here on the screen, these are laws that collectively and individually we're trying to address that. This is what I'm talking about when I say the body of work, and we've been doing it for a while. Now, in this session, my goal was to illustrate the evolution of the work, and so that's why I've grouped the developments, if you will, by decade. But I do want to say this is a bit of an oversimplification, and I made this simple like this to make a point. But even though I'm walking through today's program from this, decade by decade evolution, this work is by no means linear. You know that saying, 2 steps forward, 1 step back? Well, the same is true here. So I'm not trying to present this sequence in some form of a checklist because, as you can see on the topics on the slide here, they're sort of interrelated naturally. But as we saw just a moment ago, this progression does track a little bit along changing societal views, customs, and shared beliefs. As we saw a moment ago, the work to protect and support different groups started before the 80s. It started back, the first one I listed, I believe, was 1920. But seeing this as a collective body of work that we call now today DE&I, that started to emerge in the 70s. Excuse me. It was an effort to drive holistic change in the workplace. That started to build momentum. Diversity and inclusion, if you will, started there as a body of work. But Louis Griggs in the early 80s, he coined a term, valuing diversity. And so valuing diversity as a term evolved to what we now refer to as diversity and inclusion today, or DEI. Excuse me. Sorry, everyone. So at the time, what Griggs was trying to do was shift the lingo away from affirmative action and equal employment opportunity. That terminology, that was the terminology that had been used coming up to the 80s. And so the goal was to shift away from that. In the 2000s, we started to see efforts to address other barriers and biases beyond protected groups. And the term diversity and inclusion really started to take hold. And so did the discussion of the business case. Those discussions started to mature in the 2010s with research and surveys and data that started to show the link between diversity and performance or innovation, profitability, and all of those things. And then in the 2020s, which is basically today, the murder of George Floyd served as a catalyst for many organizations to re-examine their DEI efforts, or in some cases, to start them. And the corporate world in particular responded swiftly and visibly to social pressures that addressed systemic racism, resulting in a resurgence, if you will, of DEI efforts, bringing them top of mind. The term diversity and inclusion almost became a household term simply because during COVID, we worked from home. We brought work into our homes. This work was top of mind, highly visible, And so it shouldn't come as a surprise then that as we had this collective national dialogue, diversity and inclusion layered in with some of the challenges we're starting to see in society, it is part of what's happening around the backlash. Now, real quick, when we go back before the 80s, I did say I was going to go through the decades, but I wanted to come back a little bit and look at the foundation. So before the 80s, a lot of the foundational work was done through things like anti-discrimination laws and the civil rights movement. Those early foundations did a few things. So it created this expectation or this understanding that this work is a good thing. It's good for society, it's good for business, and of course, it's good for the workers. It also was a way, by enacting these laws, it was a way of our society for setting boundaries for treatment of workers by companies and treatment of workers, treatment of each other in the workplace. There were a series of very high-profile lawsuits in the 80s and the 90s around anti-discrimination, discrimination practices, equal treatment, etc. Now, much of this work was rooted in race and gender, which is why I have those highlighted here on the screen, because coming into the 80s, that was what brought us a lot of attention to this. There were many milestone laws that were passed. You have the Equal Pay Act that was aimed at eliminating wage disparities based on gender. The Civil Rights Act that was instrumental in enforcing anti-discrimination policies, which we saw started way earlier than that. There was the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which protected workers 40 years and older from discrimination based on age. Now, it was also in the 90s, but I'm going to mention it here, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act that passed in 1990. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, defined the disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities, including work. So the ADA provided protections to those with disabilities in the workplace, in public settings, in transportation, in government services, and in telecommunications. Now, leading up to the 80s, these all provided a really good, important foundation. But it did one other thing. It may be one of the reasons, all of this body of work, this may be the reason why we started to see this as a them or us thinking the way it's framed today. And that's because for many reasons, when we think of DEI or diversity and inclusion, what pops up to mind are these protected groups. And as a result, D&I is about them and not necessarily about us. Now, I'm not spending a lot of time here, but I do want to give this an honorable mention because many people don't realize the federal government has been collecting this data for decades. Now, to be fair, the goals of the EEO1 form, which is what organizations with 15 or more employees use to submit their demographic data to the government, there are a couple of goals, including monitoring, enforcement. The goal here is to identify patterns of discrimination and enforce anti-discrimination laws. Also for identifying disparities to help the government maybe pinpoint where discrimination might be happening. So none of this D&I work can be done without data. And so while this report is aimed at compliance for federal laws and regulations, it's also part of what has pushed organizations to begin collecting this data. Because here's the truth. Without the data, there's not much work that we could have been done in this space unless it was intellectual or emotional. But the data helps us create it, make it concrete. Now I want to pause for a moment because I realized I'm not in the Q&A. So give me a second. Jasmine, just as a quick reminder, if you can put them in the priority queue. Sorry for the pause, everyone, but put your questions in as we go along. I'm going to try to keep track of them. All right, so let's start walking into this progression through the decades. And as I take a closer look at each one, I decided to use the innovation curve to frame this conversation. This isn't exactly an innovation curve idea per se, but I actually thought it might be helpful for us to understand where the progression of the work over time, as well as help organizations or those of us in organizations try to plot where we were in terms of maturity around D&I. So when I say innovators, what do we mean? These are those that are first to adopt a new idea, to identify something new to try. They're driven by curiosity, the thrill of innovation, if you will. Then there are early adopters, and early adopters are those who started to see these changes and embrace these changes. And then you have early majority, which is people start actually adopting and implementing these because they have started to show their value. They are starting to be proven as a result of the work done by those innovators and early adopters. Then you have the late majority, and the late majority in this context is those who have been skeptical, but now we're starting to accept them. We see them as valuable, more valuable than risky, because one of the things we know about the status quo is it's safer to keep doing what we've been doing than it is to try something new. Well, that mindset starts to flip, and we see the late majority start to kick in. And then you have the laggards, and the laggards are the ones that they were holding on to that status quo mindset. They were resistant to change. There is a word here that many of us use, and I would suggest for all of us, we might want to stop using it in a way that makes it feel shamey and blamey, and that's traditional, because traditional has a lot of context. But so what I want us to think about here is those who have struggled with change, but are now starting to change, because the change inevitably happens. Now, so the 80s, I'm presenting this, if you will, as a focus on those demographics. And it's centered primarily around protecting those protected groups. So when I talk about that from a perspective of the compliance for those groups, this is where we hit the baseline. This is when we establish. Somebody asked here, what is the y-axis of my chart? What is on the x-axis? I'm not sure what chart, but Scott, maybe if you can put that back in another way, that can help me. Because I want to make sure I don't miss the question.
The previous slide, maybe?
X-axis and y-axis. Well, I think this chart is a standard illustration for the innovation curve. And so I'm not sure, I didn't actually plot out a chart per se. Hopefully that helps. So back to the baseline conversation. Here, what we started to see in the 80s is this emergence of training. Remember, I talked about Griggs and the value of diversity conversation. That led to training around anti-discrimination and anti-harassment. So this training was more about what we shouldn't be doing, as opposed to what could we do differently. There were recruitment efforts that were focused on underrepresentation, bringing diversity into the organization. And some of this also was around that national dialogue. Some of the media coverage started to change. This was, if you will, the birth of awareness. So this really marks the beginning of that body of work that emerged as diversity and inclusion. Now, representation, I wanted to define that here because representation is that bringing diversity into the workplace. So representation, as I defined it here, is the presence of at least one minority in vital roles or key levels in and across an organization. So what does this do? It creates visibility. So by that, remember I was talking about that woman who broke the glass ceiling? Well, imagine before her, there were no women in leadership. There weren't any women in the boardroom, so to speak. Well, once we saw the first woman, what that signaled to the rest of the organizations, men and women, all genders, what that signaled is, oh, you mean I can go there? That's an opportunity for me. Not only that, but what also happened was that voice, that experience, that identity was part of the dialogue of leadership in making the decisions. So we now have an increased diversity making decisions about the rest of the organization. So it's important, that representation. That's part of why bringing in diversity was critical because it's one thing for us to intellectually understand diversity. We understand demographics are changing. We know that people of different groups might have different challenges, but without firsthand experience, without lived experience in the organizations informing our decisions, talking us and helping us develop those strategies and establish priorities, it can be difficult to be effective. Representation was also the visible result of those efforts. The commitment to diversity is, I don't want to say proven, but there's some evidence of our commitment by virtue of who we're actually seeing in the organization and in leadership and at the table, so to speak. So the next part of this curve, I bring us to the 90s. And in the 90s, what we're starting to see is that the diversity efforts are starting to expand, as well as looking at those systems and practices more closely. You know, anti-discrimination is one thing, but what should we be doing so that we're being more intentional instead of avoiding, if you will? Excuse me. So then we start to see the emergence of the business case. This is where we started to see DEI roles embedded in organizations. We started to see organizations think about employee experience differently, because employee experience up until this point was about the total interactions an employee was having in an organization. This is from recruitment through onboarding, day-to-day life, etc. And then we started to see DEI roles being introduced. And by DEI roles, we mean people specifically dedicated to DEI, often unpaid at first, so volunteer roles like DEI committees or employee resource groups, or an added responsibility, a defined responsibility for HR. The 2000s, this is where we started to see diversity as an idea widely embraced, as well as efforts to improve equity, specifically related and tied to DEI, and then the emergence of inclusion as a focus. Now, when we talk about building awareness, this is where we start to see inclusion of DEI as a separate initiative, as well as embedded in those HR roles. So it's not just a good thing to do. We're actually starting to say, well, what should we be doing and who should be doing it? We move into the 2010s. Now, this is where we started to see the data in the workplace show that link. Show that link. I'm actually going to show you some of this, a key report that came out from McKinsey here in a moment. But what we questioned here, what the question here that shifts was if diversity matters to how does it impact the work? How does it impact the workplace, and what can we do about it? D&I, or diversity and inclusion, started to transition to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and we started to see the emergence of belonging. Now, those new DEI roles and responsibilities, we saw a lot more of people being hired as directors of diversity, vice presidents of diversity, some related title, chief diversity officers. One of my roles, I was director for diversity and inclusion at Grant Thornton. That was my job. And so that's what we mean by DEI focused roles. A lot of this work was also centered on when we started to think about workplace culture and employee experience and carve out of that, creating this culture of inclusion, we started to identify things like psychological safety, allyship, understanding dimensions of identity, understanding cultural differences, building community across organizations so that the few that were in an organization, they could all see each other, and those who were different could support them. Allyship, if you will. So that report that I was talking about, this was a report that came out in 2015, Why Diversity Mattered, and it's still cited in articles today because what McKinsey found is a link, not a causation, but a correlation between diversity and the financial performance of organizations. They found a linear relationship between racial and ethnic diversity and financial performance. BCG actually did a study to try to understand the link between diversity and innovation. They defined innovation as revenue from new products and services. And what they found was over a 3-year period of time that they were looking at over the study, there was an absolute link between diversity and innovation. And so, it's not causal, but there is a correlation. As organizations become more diverse, so does their profitability increase, their performance improves. And there were a couple of reports here. McKinsey was being cited. McKinsey Global Institute was talking about the importance of DEI, not just for the big guys, the big organizations. I just gendered companies. Not just for the big organizations, but for small businesses as well. This was a business imperative across the board. I thought this one was also important because how do we know we're diverse enough? Is there such a thing as diverse enough? And so what I thought was interesting here was as this data started to come in and as this analysis started happening and the conclusions we started to reach, this one, bottom sentence here, there's a suggestion that the groups we belong to and our relative standing in society, that plays a role in whether we are believing or perceiving an organization to be sufficiently diverse. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then we move to the 2020s, or essentially today. Switch back to the Q&A, to essentially today. And so today, diversity, we get it. Equity, it's embedded in those DEI efforts. Inclusion, working on it. Belonging, starting to understand it. So that's what we're doing today. So this represents a mindset shift. What we're seeing now is diversity and inclusion as an integrated element of business strategy. So rather than having a separate strategy, we're going to do D&I over here because there's a D&I strategy, but this is our organizational goals and business strategy. We are weaving DEI into that. So understanding diversity, equity, inclusion as individual principles and concepts, as well as interrelated, and how all of that weaves into sales, human resource strategy, product development, marketing and communications, creating career pathways and attracting and retaining talent. We're seeing all of it. Because DEI, the way I like to describe it, it's in the air. It isn't a thing we do on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. It is something about how we just are, which is why when I said at the beginning in the work that I do, the way I like to frame it is how do we create spaces where all of us can just be? It doesn't matter how we're different. I get the tools that I need to be successful, and they might not be the same tools that you need. But I have the tools and resources, and I don't have to pretend, and I don't have to hide, which is how you also get to this bring your whole self to work idea and authenticity. I struggle with those. I have a couple of different programs that I talk about. What does it mean when we say authenticity? What are the challenges behind that? But we started to see a progressive view and a shift into this mindset. Now, I thought that this was really interesting. There was a survey conducted by Slack's Future Forum. This was in 2022. They asked 10,000 people across 6 countries to evaluate their company's performance in DEI. 14% said that their organization was starting to understand the impact, but they hadn't defined their unique business case. 32% said they framed this the way I had framed the 80s, that they're getting started, and they're really, though, mostly doing the compliance stuff. 16% said we have a better sense of our business case. We're starting to set some goals. This might reflect more of grassroots efforts and then a budding infrastructure, if you will. So we had people to do the activities, to do the things, even though we hadn't necessarily defined the why and the bigger tie-in to our business strategy. 23% said, now we're getting somewhere. We are starting to tie that in. We're moving beyond grassroots. We've integrated DEI into what we're doing. And then 16% sustainable, which means it's embedded. It's part of our DNA. It's part of the ecosystem. These are the organizations that have put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. But it means that they're engaged and that they're moving forward and accountable for their DEI. So bringing me back then to this graphic, where we are looking forward. Okay, I say 40 years, but maybe I'm really hopeful. This is maybe where I'd like to see us in 10 years. Now, a word about the check boxes for equity and diversity. That work is never done. DEI is a journey. there is no destination here. But the reason I check off equity and diversity is because they fall into the categories, maybe 10 or 15 years from now, sooner if possible. They fall into the categories I'm hopeful of. Well, I should hope so. We don't have to discuss the whys and convince people that this is important. That goes without saying. We're just doing the work. And so that's why I've checked those off. Not to say they're done, but to say it's just part of the air we breathe. Inclusion, we're starting to really think about what that means. It's so far mainstream that those who are just starting to explore that are the ones that have been the last to adopt it. So in these last few minutes, there are a lot more slides here. I'm not going to walk through them in any great detail. What these slides are looking at is how do we create this space? So if we value diversity, we are trying to cultivate a workplace where people feel safe and connected. We're trying to create an inclusive workplace. I thought I'd provide a definition of inclusion. Now, there's a framework that I always like to use. This is called the inclusion framework, and it really helps solidify or differentiate what these different, what it feels like to be somewhere along the timeline of the lonely only or truly part of the team. So what it does is it looks at a measure of inclusivity, belongingness that they define as being treated as an organal insider. I think of that more as inclusion, but I'm going to use their terms here. And then uniqueness, which is I feel valued, seen, and respected for what makes me unique. Exclusion is I'm not an organizational insider, and I really don't feel that what makes me different is valued. Differentiation is better, and this is people value me for the skills and the things that make me unique, but I'm still not part of the group, if you will. Assimilation is the flip of that. Assimilation is I'm treated as part of the group. I'm considered an organizational insider, but what I'm doing for that to happen is sort of holding back. I'm covering things up. I'm hiding. I am playing down what makes me unique so that I can fit in. And then inclusion is I don't have to play it down, and I am fitting in. I am just accepted here for who I am. I get to be who I am, how I am. When you bring all of these things together, I sit in the middle, a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging is how I feel appreciated. I feel respected. I feel safe. So what is belonging? Belonging is a human need. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have this need for food and for shelter. And then as soon as those are taken care of, our next need is connectivity, that we need to feel part of a group to be safe. Remember, I talked about scanning our environment from an evolutionary perspective. I am looking out on the horizon for things that are different because those might potentially be dangerous. And one of the ways we stay safe is to stay collected as a group, because as a group, we're safer than we are as an individual. Well, that psychology in our brain still exists. And as a group, as part of that group in the workplace, I feel safer. And so belonging isn't something I can project onto somebody. Belonging is what I will feel as a result of how things are done, said, appear, what I experience in this space. So what I've laid out for you is a series of elements or a combination of elements that when we feel these, belonging is the outcome of this effort. That when we feel safe, when we feel seen, when we feel valued, when we feel understood, and when we feel supported, when we feel all of those things, we can feel connected to each other, brave. We have a bond with those of us at work, and it boosts our confidence. All of these things are when performance levels increase. So in the next few slides, I walk through, for example, here's a definition of psychological safety. Psychological safety essentially means that I'm not going to be punished for sharing my beliefs or asking questions or presenting different ideas or speaking up or challenging. And you can see here there's a breakdown. There are different types of psychological safety, but they all fall under the same group, that it should be safe for me to say and ask in an organization. The next one, and this is the one that I think is the most important. Now, I talked earlier about protected groups. And oftentimes when we think of D&I, this is what pops up. It's the stuff we can see, or it's the stuff we've talked about. It's the them that we're doing the work for. But I would like to invite all of us to think more holistically about diversity, because as you can see, this is the diversity iceberg that I use. The stuff at the top, those are the things that you'll see. You don't need to talk to anybody. You don't need to interact with somebody. All you need to do is see them across the room, and all of these things you will see. Some of them are more overt. Well, I'm guessing your age. It's probably not right. You might have a visible disability, your ethnicity, your race, or I'll just say skin tone, which is often tied to race and ethnicity, possibly religion. There are all of these visual cues, but look below the surface. There's so much more about us. And we're starting to understand that and approach DEI work more holistically with all of these identities in mind. Excuse me. I do not know what is happening today, but I apologize. So the reason that this is important is when we think about diversity efforts, we can't just be thinking about them. We can't just be thinking about minorities. We can't just be thinking about women or people of color or people who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, because every one of these groups, including white men, have all of these dimensions of diversity. And so we need to bring white men, white women into the conversation, because too often, and part of this negative conversation that I've been observing, this backlash, is because it's almost like people who are not these minorities, everyone else, the majority, are, okay, I'll say it, they're like the evil ones. That's probably too strong a language, but it's their fault to fix things for us. And I would like to invite all of us to understand that all of us have this need to belong, whether you are a Black, transgender, male with a visible disability, and English isn't your first language, so you have a strong accent, that person, or the white male leader who's cisgender, lives a traditional life defined in our culture, in the US culture, American culture. Both of those individuals have the same need to belong. And so that's what I mean by including everyone, that holistically looking at that diversity. That does not mean we ignore those groups that have disproportionately been impacted by barriers and systems that favor one group over another. We must do that work, but not forget that when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about everyone. Last few slides here. When I talked about lived experience, I actually brought this up earlier, bringing the experiences of those into the room who know what that feels like. Too often, we might have one group making decisions for the other group without input from the other group. I have some examples here of lived experience. These are some of the things that people might say, might fall under the gaslighting, somebody throwing things, saying something, someone else responding, and then somebody saying, oh, you're just being too sensitive, or no, it's not like that here, when in fact it is, and causing people to question their own experiences. Am I reading this here? Am I being too sensitive? Or feeling invisible or marginalized. Cultural competence, what I mean by that is understanding that there are differences, especially as the workplace becomes more global, that when we are communicating and interacting across difference, whether it's behaviors, traditions, experiences, backgrounds, language, and culture, there's a higher likelihood of miscommunication. So that's why cultural awareness and fluency is critical today to being seen and understood. And then I have here inclusive language. And inclusive language simply means using language that is respectful and not marginalizing or dismissive or rude or insensitive. Words matter. Words can hurt. And it's not just what we say, but it's also what we don't say. So what does that mean? There's some guidelines here about inclusivity that I've included, some things to think about in terms of the way we talk, not just the actual words, but inferences as well. And then the last one is as allyship. That is because those in the majority require those in the minority. In the majority, did I say that right? Those who are minorities need support from those in the majority to drive change. And that's no matter the minority majority composition and demographics. So that is not to say people of color and people who are white. That is to say the group that is smaller needs support from the group with higher representation to drive change on behalf of protections for and support of those who are in that minority. And that support, that championship, that engagement, that's called allyship. That is speaking up, advocating for, and taking action on behalf of those who are not in your group, and in particular, those who are minorities in a group. Well, thank you all for joining me today. On the handout, you should have on the page with my bio, all of my contact information. So if there's something I can answer for you, you forgot after the fact, you want to give me an email, reach out on LinkedIn. I would be happy to answer your questions. I appreciate you taking the time for me today. And I hope that this discussion has helped shift the perspective of D&I as just something we've been doing all along, and that the work will continue. It's just going to be called different names, but the intention behind the work is the same.